I am absolutely delighted to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity. I am personally very committed to doing what I can to lend research effort to making advances around social and economic mobility. I've recently had a bit of a career change. I gave up a big administrative job and a big salary to go back in front of 200 undergraduates for the first time in 20 years in an effort to kind of give myself a bit more space to focus on this research agenda that I'm really quite passionate about. So Tom asked me to start off by saying something about what I thought about the context and where we're kind of at, and I'm very happy to do that. So this is kind of my view on where we're at. I think the first thing to say is that there are a lot of people, really smart people around the world, thinking very intently about what changes in social and economic mobility might mean for ultimately equality of opportunity. That is the notion of a fair go. President Obama has called restoring economic opportunity the defining challenge of our time. And I think it's not that hard to think about why you might come to that view if you step back and take a political economy view. You think about Brexit, the election of Trump, the rise of neo-Nazi parties in Europe, Australia's merry-go-round of prime ministers. All of these things can, in some sense, very strongly, I think, be tied back to a perception or a concern about equality of opportunity diminishing for current generations of young people. One of the things that I want to say quite directly is that when you take that kind of perspective and you think about a democracy and you think about the role of the free press, perceptions may be even more important than reality, right? Much of the information that people had about migration to Britain in advance of Brexit was blatantly false. And they were being told by experts it was blatantly false. And despite that, at the end of the day, what mattered was people's feelings and perceptions about their place in the world. So I'm happy to debate numbers with everybody all day long, but at some point, I think it's important that we kind of put that aside and not worry about the nitty-gritty of whether inequality measured one way is going up or down, and actually focus on what the broader context is for people who are worrying about this. The second thing to say is that heavy hitters in the international academic community, scientific community, are pursuing major research agendas. Tom talked about Raj Shetty, Jim Heckman, who won the Nobel Prize, Richard Thaler, who won this year's Nobel Prize in economics. Lots of very smart senior people are devoting their research time and effort to trying to make advances. We are very privileged to be part of a ARC Center of Excellence. Shelley in the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence is here as a partner. Guillaume Cobb is a partner investigator. We have $28 million of taxpayer money and a 7-year research agenda, which is unheard of in the academic space, to target social and economic disadvantage in Australia. It's only the second time ever that a Center of Excellence has been funded in the social sciences. So to put this in perspective, our competitors was a group of scientists who were going to save the Great Barrier Reef, and another group of scientists who were going to find the origin of the universe. And up against that competition, we managed to persuade the ARC that social and economic disadvantage was, in fact, a very pressing social policy issue in Australia. Data. A tentative thumbs up from me. Right? I've spent 20 years complaining about data, and I don't want to do that today. Right? I think there are certainly data challenges, and we can talk about some of them. Right? One of them I feel particularly strongly about at the moment is we need to do better around what we get out of the NGO space in terms of helping them build data systems, because they're at the coalface of delivering services. And we need to know what's happening and what works. But largely, in a real sense, we're drowning in data, right? Our problem, in a way, is actually lack of research capacity and infrastructure and systems and partnerships that would let us harness the data that we actually have. Importantly, our data position is much better than many other countries, okay? I love Hilda. I know Hilda has its challenges, but it is one of the 5 best panel data sets in the world. That means there are dozens and dozens of other countries that have no panel data to compare to what we have. And yet, we're not doing as well as some of those countries in pursuing the social agenda. So I have a lot of relatives that live in the Deep South in the US. And one of the things that you would say if you were struggling to try to find something nice to say about someone is you would sort of go, bless his heart. He did the best he could with what he had, right? Well, I don't actually feel that way. I don't think we're actually doing as well as we could be doing with the data we have in hand. So my proposition today is that it's not really the data that are holding us back. Australian policy, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's certainly lots of very smart people thinking very hard, deeply committed to the issues. They're gathering evidence, trying to put in place partnerships, redesigning policy frameworks. But we're certainly a long way behind where the international community is in terms of policy momentum. It has not grabbed hold here in the way that it has in many other places. And the question I have about this is, do we have really, are we in the right space at the moment for a major social agenda? My view is that this is not necessarily the fault of the public servants. It's more my concern about where we're at with politics at the moment and where the public agenda is. Okay, so I want to start off by just doing a very quick overview of inequality. Most of this I'm going to assume you know, so I'm not going to belabor it too much. This is kind of the map of inequality around the world for 2014. The deeper the red color, the worse, or the more unequal things are. Obviously, Australia's over here, kind of, you know, in the middle, not quite as unequal as the US. And the really unequal parts of the world are places in South America, some African countries. This is a map of changing inequality. So what do we think? Is inequality going up or is it going down? The green is indicating estimates that suggest the place is getting more equal. The kind of orange color is suggesting that things are becoming less equal, okay? And on that dimension, you see what we all believe to be true about the US, which is it's becoming much less equal. And the same is true in China, New Zealand, and Australia's kind of hovering just off of that. Okay, one thing I want to kind of leave you with before we start this conversation is that I think it's really useful if you think about inequality in a very broad way, okay? So recently the Journal of Economic Perspectives did an entire issue on inequality, and it had a range of articles from some of the world's leading thinkers on inequality. And there was research articles on consumption, focusing on inequality in consumption. And really, if what you care about is individual well-being, you would think about what people were consuming, not how much income they had, okay? Mortality, we know that the gains to mortality have not been equally distributed. Some groups, some education groups, and in some geographic areas have benefited much more than others. And in fact, in the US, one of the concerns is that for some groups, life expectancy is actually going backwards. It's sort of unheard of, right? I don't think that that's probably an Australian phenomenon. I'd be very surprised to find that was true. But I think it is the case that we've been frustrated about our inability to improve life expectancy in certain groups and in certain locations. Crime. Crime has a very unequal impact in its distribution, where it occurs, and also the consequences of incarceration in the criminal justice system for different populations. Family structure. This is a work by Shelley Lumberg talking about the increasing inequality and the stability of family arrangements, which has had a major impact on the inequality in household income and intergenerational inequality. So most of the numbers that get talked about in the press are around inequality, usually in income, often in individual income, sometimes in household income, and we get into debates about the right measurement and whether it's going up or it's going down. But the important thing to keep in mind is that the notion of inequality and what's driving people's perceptions about social and economic mobility being an issue is inequality in a broad range of things. And we need to sort of remain focused on the fact that it's not just about a single measure of income. Okay, so this is actually a slide from my labor class. Sources of inequality, what's being discussed in the academic literature, the increased demand for skilled workers as a result of international trade, skill-based technical change. I think there's probably no doubt that that is true. There is also discussion about changes in labor market institutions, minimum wages, unions, tax and transfer policy. Less evidence that that's true. And thirdly, we're focused on social and economic forces, some evidence of a rise in intergenerational disadvantage and a decline in social and economic mobility, largely coming out of US evidence, okay? So I sort of would say, one, sure, need to focus on that. Two, maybe not so much, but happy to have the debate. And three, reasons to be concerned. Okay, so why did I start out talking about inequality if what I'm really meant to be doing is talking about social and economic mobility? And the answer is that the way to think about this is what inequality is doing is it's pulling apart the rungs on the social ladder. Things are getting further apart. And that makes it harder for people to climb that ladder. It's easier to move up the ladder when positions are closely aligned. But as the bottom gets pulled further away from the top, it becomes harder to move. And so this is a figure that I know you'll be familiar with. This is the Great Gatsby curve by Miles Korak, put it together in the first instance. This is Australia. This one is Andrew Lee's number that the OECD tends to use as an estimate. It's based on, something like the first 6 waves of Hilda. This is the more recent estimate by Pete Szyminski and Sylvia Mendola, and they've used more waves of Hilda. That puts Australia closer to the curve. Now, I have spoken to Andrew about his work, and what he will say is that the OECD got it wrong when they read his paper and they picked the wrong number. And he had done a bunch of sensitivity tests which would have increased the number that you would have reported for Australia, and the OECD just missed it. So some of that distance is the OECD getting it wrong, and some of that distance is the additional waves of Hilda that Pete and Sylvia had. It is true that methodologically, we know that the more information you have, the more waves you have, the more persistence or the lower social mobility is going to be. Right? Okay, so all of this leads me into equality of opportunity then. Fair inequality, what does that mean? We want people to, inequality that results from people being rewarded for their skills and their talent. That's the kind of inequality we want to live with. Unfair inequality is driven by differences in the lottery of birth. okay? And this is work that comes from colleagues at the Life Course Center at the University of Queensland. Social justice, right? How do we want to think about that? Well, equality of opportunity is typically described as offsetting differences in outcomes which are attributable to luck, but not those which are attributable to the things that people should be responsible for. Okay, so that's a pretty good statement, but it becomes very difficult to measure which part of your life, you know, if I observe differences in the outcomes for two individuals, how much of it is luck and how much of it is circumstances. Okay, it's a very difficult proposition. The only thing I want to say about that is that if you take the perspective of children, I'm prepared to argue that it's all circumstances. If we look at a group of children and we see inequality that makes us unhappy, that's got to be circumstances, right? We don't really want to hold children responsible for, at that point, for their life outcomes. Okay? And then we can have conversations about what you think about youth and adolescence. Okay, this is a Heckman number. He argues that 50% of the variation in people's permanent lifetime earnings is set in stone by the time they're 18. Now, there's debate about whether it's 50% or it's some other number. Not everyone agrees, okay? But if this is at all remotely true, then you've got to be concerned about what's happening to children and to adolescents before they exit the education system and enter the labor market. Unfortunately, it's not all about money. And I say unfortunately because if it were all about money, everybody's job would be much easier, right? Governments are excellent at taxing and transferring. That's what you're here for. But if I tell you that it's not all about money and you got to change parenting style, or you got to change aspirations, or you got to change expectations, the job has suddenly become much more complicated. And I think the more that we understand about what happens to children and adolescents, the more we understand that it's very complicated, right? There is now research demonstrating that social and economic disadvantage has implications for the brain development, the physical brain development of infants. That's a pretty scary proposition. Okay, what I want to do with the time I have left is talk about some work that we've been doing recently for Australia. Part of the reason I want to do this is that I would like to push people to thinking a little bit broader about inequality and social mobility and thinking about things other than income. And when you do that, we're actually in an exceptionally fortunate data position, right? I just presented some work last week in Santa Barbara that we're doing on income management in the Northern Territory, and I kept getting the same comment over and over. We had no idea that you had this kind of data. We don't have anything like that. Okay, what I've got is 97% of a 6-month birth cohort. These kids are literally having their 30th birthday at this moment. Okay, from the Centrelink records, we have data from 96 to 2013, so approximately from the age of 8 to the age of about 26, 27. And what we have is fortnightly payments information for the universe of 122,000 Australian children that were born in that 6-month window. Okay? The beginning part, of course, is essentially their parents' records. It's the record of the household in which they're growing up. That's between 96 and 2003, when they're about the age of 15. We then take a little break. We cut the window, and we say, okay, well, we don't know what we think about 16 and 17-year-olds. Are they getting income support in their own right, or are they getting it as a result of their family? So let's just throw that out. And what we're going to do is pick up these kids in 2005 when they turn 18 to 26. And what I can do, obviously, is I can now sort of relate the payments that young people are getting up to the age of 26 to what their parents got when they were growing up. And if you do that, okay, this is overall social assistance. So it's the typical things we would think of as income support. Importantly, it does not include youth allowance for university students, right? Nobody's worried about them, right? I show my students these numbers all the time and tell them, you're not in here. We're not worried about you, okay? If you grew up in a family where your parents had no income support at all over that period, 32% of this cohort will get some form of income support between the ages of 18 and 26. 58% of the group who grew up in a family that did receive any amount of income support will be receiving income support themselves. The ratio is 1.8, and that's the number that we kind of talk about, right? You're 1.8 times as likely to need income support yourself as an adult if your parents received it. Now, if that's not a notion of intergenerational disadvantage, a lack of social and economic mobility, I don't know what is. Okay, you can do the same for different programs. Disability, we have that split into physical and mental disability and CARES payments, the two parenting payments, partnered and singled, and unemployment, okay? And you get fractions that somewhere hover about that. Sometimes they're a bit more. That's particularly true. Disability was a particularly surprising thing. Disability, very bad. It doesn't happen to many kids that they grow up in families with disabled parents, but if you do, that really has consequences for your lifetime outcomes. Okay, what we've done here is of that proportion of kids who grew up in income support, right, the orange bar, we have split the fraction into two pieces. One piece, the bottom, the lighter orange, is due to the fact that your parents simply went on to the income support roll. So imagine the scenario, your parents go into the income support roll, but they actually get $0 or very close to $0. What impact does that have? The top orange bit is the impact of the intensity or the amount of dollars. So we talk about the bottom as being the extensive margin, the top being the intensive margin, okay? The sum of the bars are the same as they were in the previous graph. All I've done is split it in two pieces, okay? The takeaway message here is that most of the difference in these kids is not in the amount or the intensity of what their parents got. It's the simple fact that their parents got anything at all. Okay, what does that tell you? These families are really different. There is something very different about these families. Okay? You get the same answer, it varies slightly, but in the case of mental disability, for example, it's all about the parent's disability. It is not about the intensity of payments. So if you were worried that somehow we had a welfare culture and large amounts of payments were somehow putting kids further behind, I would argue that this is evidence that that's not really the case. There is not a lot of evidence that getting $1 or getting tens of thousands of dollars is making much of a difference in what happens to kids. It's a simple fact that the parents needed help in the first place that's leading to outcomes.
Sorry, can I just ask one quick question? Is that continuously collecting over the period of 96 to 2014, or is it just at any point in time?
This is any point in time.
So they might have done it for a year and then come
yeah.
back again.
But these are based on the actual dollars,
okay.
Right? So that's why this is interesting. So the dollar number captures kind of, are you getting full benefits or not, but it's also capturing how many fortnights you were getting benefits. Okay? And I just want to leave you with youth unemployment. Okay? So this is now the outcome, or the thing I'm focused on, is whether kids are getting unemployment benefits at some point between 18 and 26. And what I've done is I've classified what kind of payments their parents were getting. You're about 3 times as likely to get unemployment benefits if your parents had any form of social assistance where you were growing up. And I can split that, again, by disability and parenting payments or unemployment. Okay? And the thing that was sort of surprising to us that's really a takeaway is if you're concerned about this disparity in kids' chances of being on unemployment, it's not parental unemployment you'd be worried about. It's parental disability. That gap, the 25 to 57, is almost a 2-fold difference. And that's actually a bigger ratio. That's a bigger gap than parents who are on unemployment benefits themselves. As far as I'm aware, there is no other country in the world that has these kind of data. You can study programs in isolation. You can study intergenerational and unemployment benefits, sometimes in disability benefits. But having the ability to study intergenerational disadvantage across the entire social safety net is really a unique proposition. Okay, so my priorities for going forward, I just want to leave you with 2 things to think about. I've been kind of pushing this idea for a while, and I'll just keep pushing it. I think what we have to do is get better at using our administrative data to work out what's working for children and what's not. The reason is we do not have enough money to run an evaluation where we have to collect panel survey data on treatment and control groups every time we want to know what works. What I need to do is look at kids in the school data and figure out which kids had which things when they were growing up and how their outcomes are different. What I want us to do is issue those student numbers at birth. Right? You're issuing them when kids enter school. Roll it back. Issue them at birth. Tell parents that we as a society are committed to lifelong learning, and what happens to those children in the lead up to school is an important part of their human development. And while we're at it, let's get over the fact that we can't stand state comparisons, and please make these things comparable nationally. At the moment, every state is issuing state identification numbers, and I can't track kids as they move across states. Now, this one seems to me to be very simple. Some co-ed committee somewhere ought to be able to do this with a stroke of a pen. And the fact that we're not, in my view, is close to criminal. It's just unbelievable, right? Issue those numbers at birth. Then when those kids show up for their health checks, whatever it is, they turn up in pediatricians' offices or in some sort of state protection, or they go to the Brotherhood and they do the hippie program or whatever it is, we're going to know. And when they hit school, I'm going to know something. Okay, that's me saying it again. Second thing, let's do a better job of transitioning youth from formal education to employment. Okay? This is a place where if you want to know who's doing it well, look at France. Right? I've heard the French talk about this. A particular minister of labor became concerned about youth immigration. And if you were France, you would know why they would feel that way. Set aside money to do social experiments, targeting disadvantaged young people, and what would work to get them into employment. At the end of the day, your best social policy is a strong and inclusive labor market. And anything you can do to transition kids successfully into the labor market, prevent them falling behind, is a big win for breaking that cycle of intergenerational disadvantage. Okay, I'm done.